Today I'm going to be reviewing Old School Essentials. Now, Old School Essentials is a recreation of the original Basic and Expert role-playing game rule set, created in 1981. This particular edition was published back in 2019, was written by Gavin Norman as a successor to his previous series, Basic and Expert Essentials. The rebranding also came with a huge quality increase, and the product is available in a number of formats. Specifically, what I'm going to be looking at today is the modular book format, but it is also available as one large book. So inside this lovely box, there are 5 smaller books, and then those are all combined in one tome called the Rules Tome. The reason that this is got a modular format is because with the design of it, it's trying to lean in to the format of the old school revival of being very modular and very composable and things being very cross-compatible with each other. And that cross-compatibility in this instance comes from it having lots of different books such that you can swap things out. So let's say you don't want to play a fantasy game, you want to play a sci-fi game, you could take someone else's sci-fi expansion and combine that with the core rules. Maybe you want fantasy monsters showing up in the sci-fi, you add in the fantasy monsters book with the sci-fi monsters book. So you can have a lot of variety in how things work and the kind of game you want to play. But if you just want a simple, pure recreation of Basic and Expert in one book, that is available too. The other thing I'll mention is that I have had this game since it came out. I was a Kickstarter backer, very late to the Kickstarter, but I did back it before it finished. Any dinks or scratches on these are all purely my doing, having owned this and run it somewhat weekly ever since it came out at a society where I run games of it. And this is my OSR game and in fact Dungeons & Dragons style game of choice now. So I will hopefully over the course of this review explain more thoroughly why I think this product is probably the best OSR game on the market, and also will hopefully show you some of its fantasticness. So to get started, let's just quickly go through. So within the box we have got the core rules. Now this contains the heart of Old School Essentials. It's quite thin, coming in at 80 pages, but it has everything you need to run basically any kind of D&D dungeon crawling style game that you want. We then have the classic fantasy genre rules. This splat book contains classes and items and all of your classic fantasy equipment. It is supplemented with a cleric and magic user spellbook. Now, the reason why these are separate is because you may want to own multiple copies of the spellbook so you can hand them around the table while keeping the actual core rules in for the fantasy setting in one nice compact place. So that's the division there. Then we have our monsters book, and then we have got our treasures book. All of these combined form the Old School Essentials classic or core lineup. There are already 2 additional books out in Gavin's series, which are the Advanced Fantasy Genre Rules and the Advanced the Druid and Illusionist Spells, to supplement those in the same way that Cleric and Magic User supplements Classic Fantasy Genre Rules. Those are best thought of as a sort of supplement that brings in AD&D content into this older format. If you're not familiar with Basic and Expert, I'm not going to distinguish between Old School Essentials and Basic and Expert. I'm going to critique the rules of Basic and Expert as if they were their own thing. Indistinguishable from I'm not going to emphasize the divide between the formatting and layout and presentation that Gavin has done in Old School Essentials and the original rules of Basic and Expert. I'm going to review this as a complete package so that you understand what you're getting if you buy the product, if you don't already own it. I guess the best place to start is the core rules. So the books are designed with this very, very nice binding. The very first thing you'll notice when you open the book is that the end papers are fantastic. The end papers alone are basically enough for you to run the entire game as reference material. So for the core rules, we have got rules on how adventuring works, we have got rules on encumbrance, we have got coin weights, we have got the procedures for dungeons, the procedures for wilderness, we have got the procedures for encounters, the procedures for combat, and then the combat tables. This is basically the whole game laid out in one concise format. And this is really something I want to emphasize, is the core thing that Gavin has done is laid this out fantastically, but the other thing is really highlighting the procedures, because this game doesn't have a universal resolution mechanic. It doesn't have a universal dice mechanic. You need all sorts of different dice for all sorts of purposes, as you'll see when we get into it. But what it does have is a universal system that is woven throughout the entire book that is these procedures that provide very clear, very concise enumerated lists that you loop through on a certain period. So this every 10 minutes, this every day, this one when an encounter starts, and this one every 10 seconds in combat. And you just loop through these periodically, and that provides 99% of the content out of this. And that is really a fantastic and elegant approach. Lots of games have this kind of procedural approach. If we talk about something like 5th edition, you roll for initiative, and then you go into rounds. And then in a round, people have an action, a bonus action, but how those interact with each other isn't anywhere near as rigid and well-defined, and has lots of, specific instances overwriting the general pattern. Whereas here, the general patterns are these very, very well thought out codified lists of here's how you go through. And hopefully we can get into those in more detail. So to start with our actual content, we have an introduction that just talks a little bit about what role-playing is. It talks a little bit about the game and how it's set up. Terminology. We clarify what our dice are and how dice work. Dice notation, modifiers, explains how to roll a D100. X and 6 rolls. Some rolls specify an X and 6 chance of success. This indicates that a 1d6 should be rolled and the result compared against the specified chance. So this is a pattern you're going to see all over the book of these sort of roll under checks that are, you've got a blank in blank chance of succeeding, with X and 6 being by far the expected one. A lot of the systems in this game actually revolve around these X and 6 checks. So it's good that it's got its own somewhat notation and is explained how it's intended to be rolled. We go into game terminology. So in this game we have a referee. We don't have a game master or a dungeon master. You have players, obviously, who have player characters. A party, which is made up of player characters. An adventure, your campaign, non-player characters, monsters. It teaches you all of the core lingo. Fantastic if you've never run this kind of thing before. It then breaks down the main kinds of adventures you're going to be having, which are wilderness and dungeons. There's also waterborne, and there are rules for seafaring adventuring in here, if that's what you're into. Then we talk about the supplements, so treasure, monsters. We also talk about magic and the non-monstrous sentient species of the world in some vague detail here to give you an idea that this is a fantasy book. Here it talks about which books you need. So basically you need a genre rules, a spell set if your genre rules require spells, a monsters book and a treasure book if you plan on having those things in your game. And it encourages you to mix and match. We have these beautiful full panel arts that are really quite stunning all throughout the book, and the quality is fantastic, both on the paper and on the artwork. Next up, the book goes straight into character creation. So it talks about what characters have. They have their ability scores: strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma. Doesn't explain what they are yet, but it does explain that those are bounded between 3 and 18, with 3 being the worst and 18 being the best. That's very useful as a sort of quick introduction because it helps people understand how to read their character sheet. We have classes. Races, unless a demi-human class is selected. So that's demi-human class, as you'll read, is the term for things like elves and dwarves, what these days we would consider non-human races. Unless a demi-human class is selected, the character is assumed to be human. So this is a really important note of Old School Essentials, and that is essentially, in a lot of role-playing games, you end up with a world that is supposed to have a lot of humans in and a party that has none. You will very rarely get that in Old School Essentials because most of your class options are human. And so by far, the majority of characters you're going to see are going to be human characters. I've picked up a lot of halflings in the game that I run, but in general, this pattern of your class also being your race and that being human almost all of the time really lends itself to these human-dominated worlds that feel a lot more authentic and help make elves and dwarves and feel just a little bit more outsidery and a little bit more unnatural, which I really like for the feel of my game. Experience level and experience points, you gain XP, you level up. Prerequisites, so this is another interesting one. So unlike in more modern editions, your ability scores really don't matter for much at all. There is a system for ability checks. I very rarely call for ability checks, and I think the prevailing wisdom amongst a lot of people that run Old School Essentials is to not use ability checks. But because of that, your prerequisites, you have to wonder what are your ability scores for. Well, one of the main things that they do, as you'll see later, is determine how much experience you get. So if you're a magic user, if you're a wizard, and you have high intelligence, you will level up faster than someone with low intelligence. So although your intelligence isn't actually needed for the casting of your spells, if you're playing a magic user, or rather I should rephrase, if you have rolled an intelligent character, you are encouraged to be a magic user, because you will level up faster. Alignment. So alignment, you can think of more like factions. You have this law, neutral, and chaos faction. This is very apparent if you read a module from back in the 80s, like Keep on the Borderlands. I will read the descriptions of it in more detail when we get to them, but basically it just sort of broadly determines the moral code and stances of a character. Very different to the current 9 alignment personality test system that you see in modern 5th edition D&D. Much more comparable to, the old school style, but like I said, a faction system of you've got the law versus chaos. You can think of it like alliance versus horde if you've ever played World of Warcraft. Hit points, how far away you are from dying. An important thing to note is when a character is harmed, their current hit point total is reduced. If this number reaches 0, the character is dead. So you don't have any buffer against death other than those hit points. And as you will see, for low-level characters, you have very few hit points. Now, you might think this leads to a high lethality game. What this actually leads to is a low combat game, which I think is excellent. Hit dice is how you determine how many hit points something has. Armor class is how well something avoids being hit. And now we're going to get into 2-hit armor class 0. So this is one of the quirks of older editions, and that is the armor class lower is better, so that first class armor is better than second class armor, which, makes some sense and is from the wargaming background that the terms actually come from. However, that does mean that you have a roll that you need to roll to hit armor class 0, and then another roll that you need to hit armor class 1. And so if we consult this large table at the back, if you have a 2-hit armor class of 2-hit armor class 0 of, let's say, 16, then you will hit something with armor class 4 on a roll of a 12 or higher. That system is very antiquated these days. There's a lot of alternative ways to resolve it. I personally like one which is called Target 20, but for old school essentials, due to the way the numbers work, it should be called Target 19. But what I think is nice, if we go back to where we were, there is an optional rule here for using ascending armor class, using a more modern style of higher number equals better armor class. And whenever there is a 2-hit armor class 0 number written out, next to it, an equivalent attack modifier will be written that you can just add into your dice roll instead of needing to consult the 2-hit matrix, which I think is a fantastic addition. And in these few places where Gavin has added content or diverged from content in the original Basic and Expert, this is a magnificent addition. Next up, you have your saving throws. Now, this is another important thing to note. You have 5 categories of saving throws, and that is versus death or poison, versus wands, versus paralysis or petrification, versus breath, versus attacks, and versus spells or magic rods or staves. These are rolled when you come across that threat. So instead of your saving throw, and I'll refer to 5th edition here, referencing what ability you use to avoid harm, you use Constitution to avoid poison, you use Dexterity to avoid Dragonfire, it simply comments on the thing you are avoiding and leaves how you avoid it up to you, which I think is magnificent narratively, because it means that perhaps the fighter uses their raw Constitution, their raw strength to survive Dragonfire by bracing behind their shield and tolerating the heat. Perhaps a cleric holds forward a holy symbol and parts the flames in front of them. Perhaps a magic user conjures a small shield that protects them. You really have a lot of narrative freedom in what the save looks like. Let's say you're saving versus death. Your character is trying to jump across this large chasm, and if they fall in, they'll die. That's a save versus death. If they are a thief or a fighter, they just run and jump the gap with their physical prowess, whether it's strength or dexterity. If they are a magic user, maybe they summon a platform in midair and jump off of it really quickly, pulling off a double jump essentially. If they are a cleric, maybe as they reach the other side, they grab on narrowly, and the strength of their conviction in their god gives them the strength to pull themselves up. You've got all of this narrative freedom over what those saves look like, and I think that is fantastic, because it makes threats outside of combat, it makes threats where it is not just you are attacked and your HP gets reduced, so much more narratively interesting. Movement rate, how fast you move, has a couple different encumbrance systems in the book. We'll talk about those when we get to them. And finally, class abilities, the things your class can actually do. Next up, creating a character. And again, Gavin has taken this wonderful procedural step-by-step layout. Obviously, this is one that you'll need to do whenever you make a new character, which, if you're playing recklessly, could be fairly often with death on 0 hit points. So the very first thing you do before anything else is roll your ability scores, 3d6 for each of your character's ability scores, strength, intelligence, wisdom, dex, constitution, and charisma, in order. So this is an important thing. You roll them down the line in order. You are not deciding what your character's abilities are here. You are not choosing what your character is best at. You are discovering what character you have rolled, and then you're choosing a class that fits them. That's a very different style to modern D&D, to 5th edition, where you choose your class and then you assign your stats to suit your class. And it leads to a lot more variety in the kinds of things people play, because, you don't get to choose your dump stat. You don't get to say, well, I don't really need this stat, so I'm just going to have less of it. Instead, you have the stats you have, and you have to make them work for you, which is this very different, very emergent style of play, which Old School Essentials is full of. Next up, you can adjust your ability scores. Now, those prime requisites I mentioned before aren't just for giving you bonus XP. You can actually increase your prime requisite, which means if you are a fighter, say, if you're going to pick a fighter, let's say you rolled strong strength. You roll, say, a 13 in strength. Not only are you then encouraged to pick a fighter, you then have the power to make your strength even better at the cost of your strength, intelligence, or wisdom. You can't trade dexterity, constitution, or charisma for stats. You can only trade strength, intelligence, and wisdom, which is a bit quirky, but we'll roll with it. And you can't reduce them beneath a 9, so you cannot make yourself bad at something. But which we'll get to in a minute with the modifiers, but basically 9 is the lowest not bad number that you can roll, and so you can't make yourself bad at something in order to make yourself better in your prime requisite, but you can bring yourself down to average or make your average a more sort of low-end average. And some character classes may have additional constraints. Basically, the thief can't reduce their strength to pump their dexterity, and that's to stop them becoming sort of this one-stat class that just pumps dex and ignores everything else, which makes sense. We'll get to it later. So next, you note your ability score modifiers. These are overleaf. We'll talk about them when we get to them. You note your attack values. So again, this is using this Thaco chart that they provide the level 1 row of here. If you're using the ascending armor class, then obviously you'd note your attack bonus here. Next up is noting your saving throws and class abilities, rolling your hit points. So you just roll your hit dice, which is dependent on your class, but it's between d4 and d8. That's how many hit points you have. Now, an important thing to note, most weapons deal about d6 damage. You should be expecting to take d6 damage if you get hit by something, which means if you've only got d4 hit points and 0 is death, at level 1, you are permanently on death's door. A single swing of a sword not only can kill you, it is likely to kill you. Which, like I said, you might think creates this style of play where people die all the time, but instead it just creates the style of play where people avoid combat or look for ways to get around combat, which is actually really fun and creates a very different style of play that I enjoy a lot. Next up, your alignment. Again, we'll get to that on page 16, talk about it a bit more. Note your known languages. So again, as avoiding combat's important, the languages you speak are also really important, because whether or not you can communicate to the pack of kobolds you come across that you don't want to kill them might make a huge difference in how they treat you. Next up, buying equipment. You roll 3d6 times 10 to determine how much gold you have, and then you can go shopping in your genre rules book, which we'll get to later. Next up, your armor class, based on the armor you've purchased and your dexterity. Again, we'll see that on the next page. Note your level and XP, level 1 and 0, and name your character. Here is the explanation of ability scores, and this is actually what I think is quite important. Because you don't really use, there is no global modifier. You don't have a strength mod. You have a strength modifier to melee, and you have a strength modifier to open doors, but you do not have one universal modifier. You can see this, for example, down where in dexterity, you've got -3 and -3, -2, -2, -1. You have these missile and AC character columns that have one modifier. The initiative column has a completely different structure for its modifiers. So there is no universal mechanic, which I mentioned before. The way this mostly manifests is in your modifier being less important. In 5th edition, your modifier is everything. It gets added to all of your dice rolls based on what your attribute is. Here, things are much more limited in scope. Strength directly just represents your ability to both hit and hurt things in melee combat, and how well you can open doors if they are stuck, just trying to force them open. Intelligence is the number of languages you speak, which, as I said, is very important for avoiding combat, and how well you can read or write. That's it. Dexterity determines your armor class, so how well you avoid taking damage. Your missile modifier, how well you can hit things with missiles, but not how well you hurt them. And your bonus to initiative, how likely you are to be able to act before your opponent, if your referee is using the optional individual initiative rules, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. Next up, you've got charisma over here, which is your NPC reactions. So NPC reactions are how non-player characters react to you. Basically, if you have really bad NPC reactions, they are more likely to interpret you as hostile and something that is a threat they need to fight. And if you have good NPC reaction modifier, they are more likely to treat you as a friend. But instead of it being you that is the active component, it is more the face value interpretation of you that the enemy has. Wisdom gives you benefits to making saving throws versus magic. Now, I'll note this does not mean versus the spells category, the spells, rods, and staves, because you could have paralysis that is magical, someone magically paralyzing you, that you add this bonus to, or you could have non-magical paralysis, such as a rock falling on you and pinning you to the ground. Wisdom helps protect you from magic. Constitution helps increase your hit points on every single dice roll, which can obviously help you out a lot when you're only working with d6 hit points. And your prime requisite modifier is how much extra XP you gain based on your most important stat, or for some classes, mostly the demi-humans, I think maybe entirely the demi-humans, based on multiple stats. We finally make it to alignment. So there are 3 alignments. Law. Lawful beings believe in truth and justice. To this end, they will follow laws and believe all things must adhere to order. Lawful beings also believe in sacrifice to a greater good and will choose the good of a larger group over the good of an individual. So this is your alliance mentality. Neutrality. Neutral beings believe in a balance between the ideas in law and chaos, and in their actions tend to do what will serve themselves. They might commit good or evil acts in order to further their own ends, and generally will not put others' needs ahead of their own. This is where the vast majority of humans are. I would say this also sort of fills the role of being unaligned, although it says that you believe in a balance between the ideas of law and chaos. I don't think that's literally you are striving for there to be an equal balance between them. It's more, you don't think either side is purely right. And then chaos. Chaotic beings are in direct opposition to law. These beings should seldom be trusted, for they tend to act in evil ways and are utterly selfish. Chaotic characters believe in chance and that there is no innate order to life. So this is very much your horde perspective. I guess to use a more modern example than World of Warcraft, this is sort of your Demacia, this is sort of your Noxus approach of order versus freedom. The player must inform the referee of the alignment, but does not need to tell the other players. Makes sense. Role-playing alignment. Bit of a guide on how to roleplay alignment, but if you roleplay against your alignment, then the referee might apply penalties. Languages, an explanation of the languages. Experience, it goes up, you gain levels. And wealth, there is money, it comes in different currency levels. Now, one thing that's interesting is that this gold coinage system is baked into the core rules, not into the genre rules. Now, the idea behind this is that if you are playing a variant genre rule, say sci-fi, they will simply tell you that, hey, what was gold is now credits, and you just transpose the system over. Domains and hirelings. So this is actually quite important. At higher levels, domain play becomes much more significant in this, where you're owning land and managing armies and that kind of thing. And so the rules for this are all laid out briefly in here. Party organization. This is really important. So it advises you to set a marching order, which is very useful, just so that the referee knows roughly what order players are going to be in at any time. The caller, you assign a player to tell you what the party wants to do. This very much helps speed up the moments where everyone's just sort of talking over each other and trying to figure out what's going on, because you can just, as the referee, hand off control to a player, and you'll be surprised how much quicker everyone organizes what they want to do when it's a player trying to get the information out of them, not the referee, and it frees up your time to actually keep track of the systems of the game, rather than trying to get a concrete idea of what your players are doing out of your players. The mapper, person that draws maps. In some games, I personally don't use a mapper, I just give people maps, but if you want to describe rooms and have your players draw a map, that is the intention of the rules. And then rules on how to divide treasure. We have systems for the passage of time, so the game is largely broken down into days, rounds, and days, hours, rounds, and turns. So a day is a day. An hour is a 24th of a day, a turn is 10 minutes, and a round is 10 seconds. So that is the sort of cyclic time units of the game. We talk about encumbrance. We have 2 encumbrance systems. One where you track the individual weights of every item you have, and then use that against a set of thresholds to determine your movement speed. And then another where your armor, and whether you found a big horde and are carrying it or whether you're not, determines your movement speed. Rules on how to run ability checks. Like I said, these are not something that I personally use, but if you do want to run them, it's roll a d20 equal to or under your relative attribute. Damage and healing. Death on 0. If a character is killed by a destructive spell or special attack, such as a lightning bolt or a dragon's breath, their equipment is assumed to be destroyed. However, magic items get their own individual saving throws. So magic items might not be destroyed by dragonfire, is the sort of the premise there. Healing. For each full day of complete rest, so no short resting, no long resting, you sit in bed for 24 hours, a character or monster recovers 1d3 hit points. And so that means attrition is a real thing. You don't have many hit points, and if you lose any of them, you are at a big disadvantage. I personally up this a bit in my game. I treat it as a full night's rest for 1d3 plus constitution modifier to hit points. So it gives people a lot more more hit points back, but I also give it to monsters. So escaping and recuperating is also a viable strategy for monsters in my game as well. Rules as written, it is 1d3 for a full day's rest. Though magical healing also exists, if you have a cleric, then they can just burn all their spells trying to heal you up. Saving throws, I went over these categories before, as well as when to roll. Basically, whenever there is non-combat peril, that is what a saving throw is for. You roll them by rolling equal to or over the saving throw value. Hazards and challenges. We have rules for climbing, rules for darkness, rules for falling, rules for getting lost, rules for swimming, rules for starving, rules for wandering monsters and being attacked. And now we get into the meat of the system, dungeon adventuring. And this is something that I want to focus on, is this little procedure overview up here. Sequence of play per turn. First, the referee makes a check to see if wandering monsters turn up. Now, this won't be every turn. This will be based on the threat level of the dungeon. It might be every other turn. It might be once every 3 turns. It might be once every hour. Actions. The party decides what action to take, e.g. moving, searching, listening, or entering rooms. So actions are this collective thing that the party agrees what they are doing as a group. You might let them each do individual things, but they are all resolved together as this is what the party does this turn, within this 10 minutes. Description. The referee describes what happens if monsters or encounters follows the procedure described in encounters. And then the turn ends, the referee updates time records with special attention to light sources, spell durations, and the party's need to rest. Basically, this is the core gameplay loop of the game. This is what you will spend most of your time doing. And it is a really elegant way to present dungeon adventuring. I will go into a little bit more detail into what other dungeon adventuring rules we have here. So, rules for secret doors, locked doors, and stuck doors. Doors just close behind you a lot of the time, and so if you carry pitons, you can keep them open. Monsters are not stopped by doors, even if they're stuck. They can often just get past them, which means that monsters have a home field advantage in dungeons. Listening at doors. Players have a 1 in 6 chance, or 2 in 6 for most demi-humans, to be able to hear monsters on the other side of a door, so you can be prepared and not surprised when you break open the door. I have an entire blog article about surprise and how it's basically the game's stealth system, but I'll talk about it a little bit when we get to it. But hear noise is a fantastic way. Using this listen at door skill is a fantastic way to get information and get ahead of the enemy so that you do not get surprised, you do not just get wiped out instantly. Because as much as combat is dangerous and you should avoid it, it's a lot easier to avoid if you know there's something evil on the other side of a door. So codified rules for that kind of thing, really good. Movement is you move based on your movement rate every turn. It's actually a very slow rate because, and I like to say this because you're assuming player competency. Players don't need to tell you they're checking for traps. They are checking for traps. That's why they have a chance to not set them off. They're being careful. They are not, slipping over and tripping. They are being cautious. They are staying hidden in case a monster comes around a corner. They are always in the safest place they possibly can be, and that is because of this very slow movement rate. Resting. Characters must rest for 1 turn every hour in the dungeon, so they can't be going non-stop. Every now and again they have to just sit down and wait, and that's a chance that something might walk in on them instead of them walking in on something, which gives this huge variety to the circumstances in which encounters happen. Searching. Rules for searching for traps and hidden doors if players want to explicitly check an area rather than it just being wrapped up in their sort of gradual progression. And rules for how traps work. And then finally, rules for wandering monsters, determining how far away they are. So do they show up right on top of the party, rounding a corner, or are they a bit further away and the party might be able to hear them coming if they're being careful? We have our wilderness adventuring procedures. Now, much in the same vein as the dungeon adventuring, these procedures provide a very, very solid core loop for what you do in the game. You decide where you're going. You check if you get lost. You check if you come across any monsters. The referee describes the terrain passed through and any sites of interest that the party comes across, asking players for their actions as required. If monsters are encountered, follow the procedures for encounters. This is a daily sequence of play, so oftentimes you are just describing an entire day's passage and moving on to the next day, which actually makes overland travel very quick and very interesting. And again, it puts a lot of narrative control with the referee, but that's not a bad thing because it lets them add a lot of flavour and embellishment. And then finally, the referee updates their time records. Through the rest of this, we have distance, flying, you can forage and hunt. If you're running low on food to prevent you from starving to death, you can forage and hunt while you're travelling. Well, you can forage while you're travelling, or you can spend a whole day hunting, and that will possibly help you preserve your rations. Getting lost, Distances, resting, you need to rest every day, and you need 1 day of rest per 6 days of travel. Very similar to the 1 turn of rest per hour. Surprise and getting surrounded. If the party is surprised by 3 or more monsters, the monsters have moved to encircle the party. So it gives you this very quick narrative guidance that, and we'll get to surprise when we talk about the encounter procedure here, but it gives you guidance that, hey, people can just get surrounded. That's in the rules. Visibility, how far characters can see, and again, a guide on how to run wandering monsters. Waterborne adventuring, I'm going to skip over because I've never run it and I have no intention of running it, but if you want to run a seafaring adventure, there are rules for it and there are rules for wind conditions. I will take a quick focus on the sequence of play, deciding course, losing direction, determining weather, wandering monsters, description, and end of day. So it flows very similarly to the overland travel rules, but with lots of variants for how things work when you're out on the open ocean. And finally, encounters. So this is the sequence that begins at the start of an encounter. An encounter begins when the characters stumble onto a monster, either because the referee has planned an encounter in the area the PCs are exploring, or because the random die roll indicates an encounter in Wandering Monsters. Surprise. The referee rolls for surprise. So the very first thing that happens is you determine if there is surprise. Each side that is not already aware of each other's presence rolls 1d6. The referee rolls for monsters, a player rolls for the players, and on a result of a 1 or a 2, the side is surprised. This is the game's stealth mechanic. If your opponent, if the enemies are surprised, then they do not see you coming. And as we will see when we get into the evasion rules, you can just run away. You can just choose not to fight them. Or you can choose to take the upper hand, automatically have initiative, get that surprise in, and maybe deal with them as a threat before they even have a chance to respond. Next up is determining encounter distance. So again, how far away is the encounter? Then it is initiative. Rolling to see who acts first if surprise hasn't come into play, and then parties decide their actions. Now, it's worth noting, this is not combat actions. This is a different set of actions that happen at the encounter scale, which explicitly is separate from combat, because most encounters, both the players and the monsters, don't want to resolve in combat, because that's putting their lives on the line, and everyone has about 2 hit points. So let's talk about those actions for a moment. So player characters decide how they act, and we'll talk about the common actions in a moment. Monster actions. The referee determines monster's reaction to the party. Sometimes circumstances make it obvious how a monster will react. Otherwise, the referee may roll on the table below to determine how a monster reacts to the party. If one specific character attempts to speak with the monsters, that character's NPC reactions modifier due to charisma is used to modify the monster's reaction roll. Higher is better, from friendly to attacks immediately. But the vast majority of time, this will be an uncertain reaction where the monsters and the players have to kind of feel each other out and figure out what's going on here. Common actions include combat. If one side attacks, casts spells, or makes tactical movement, begin tracking time in rounds following the combat procedure on page 40. If someone takes a combative action, you drop into the combat procedure. Evasion. If one side decides to flee, the other side decides to pursue, you jump into the evasion procedure, which you succeed automatically on if you have surprise. Parlay. PCs may attempt to communicate with monsters. Opening an encounter this way can often influence the monster's behavior due to these reaction rolls. If both sides decide to talk, the negotiation may be role-played, or the referee can just summarize the interaction, depending on the comfort levels of your players. Movement. The party might decide to reposition. A character can move up to 1/3 of their base movement rate per round, or a certain distance in the wilderness. And evasion. Just here is the more fleshed out evasion procedures before you get into full evasion procedures. So the full evasion procedures have got different rules for dungeon versus wilderness. In wilderness, it's based on the size of both the search party and the fleeing party. A smaller group is easier to run away, and a larger group has more searching power, so it just kind of breaks out like that. As well as for evading if you are in the ocean. In a dungeon, it basically comes down to how fast are you? Do you maybe throw some food to entice the monster to stop and eat it? Those sorts of things. Next up is the combat procedures. So the combat procedures are what stands between you and death if you do end up in the unfortunate circumstance where you have to fight something. Let's get another zoom in and talk about these procedures. First of all, declare spells and retreats. So this is important because of the way initiative works. There is no opportunity attacks in this system. There is no reactions. Everything happens part of the procedure, which means that if you want to interrupt someone's spell casting, you can't do that with a reaction. You have to win initiative, and they have already said they're going to cast a spell. If you want to punish someone for retreating, hit them in the back as they're running away like an opportunity attack, they have to declare it, and then you win initiative. So what this means is that step 1 of initiative is basically start casting spells and start running away, because that might matter later in the round if you lose initiative to penalise you by having your spell be interrupted by you being hit with a sword, or by having your retreat be penalised by you getting stabbed in the back. Initiative, as before, d6s, with optional rules for individual initiative down here, where each player rolls initiative instead of each side. Declare spells and retreats, as I mentioned. Movement. So if you are in melee, you basically can't move very far at all, which means you have to take that retreat action if you want to get out of melee. Outside of melee, you can move fairly freely. Missile attacks, how those work. Spell casting, you need freedom. You can't do anything else on your turn. You can't move, and you need to be able to see the thing you're casting at, unless noted by spell's description. And spells can be disrupted. If you lose initiative and you are successfully attacked, or you fail a saving throw before your turn comes up, your spell is lost. Note it says successfully attacked, not hit. So this is some debate whether this means successfully attacked means you have to be hit, or whether it just means someone has to make an attack on you. But depending on how you run that, that can be extremely penalising. Melee attacks are possible within 5 feet, and then the other side's act, you just repeat the procedures before for the other side. Other combat issues: attacking from behind, blindness, bombing if you've got a flying character, invulnerabilities, so silvered weapons and werewolves, things like that, paralysed opponents, spacing, how many attackers can strike at a single opponent based on how wide it is. In a 10-foot wide passages, normally at most 2 to 3 characters can fight side by side in a 10-foot wide passageway, so good guidelines there. I believe in AD&D it's 2 with swords or 3 with spears, so you can sort of apply that how you want, but it just says 2 to 3. Subduing, so if you want to just knock an opponent out instead of killing them. Unarmed attacks. Unstable surfaces, if you're fighting on a ship that's moving through rust seas, or you're on a flying mount, or just a regular mount, I suppose. Your missile attacks suffer, and it's difficult to cast spells. Water, what happens when you're underwater or in water? Though I will note, it just says attack and damage rolls should be penalised. So it does leave a lot of that up to the fiat of the referee. And then morale. So it's an optional rule, but most creatures have a morale rating, and it goes between 2 and 12. 2 is a coward that will never fight unless they have no other option, and 12 is a creature that will always fight until it is killed. You see this on a lot of undead. They're already dead, so they don't fear death. You make 2d6 and compare it against the morale rating. If you get higher, then the monster will surrender, and if you get equal or lower, the monster will continue to fight. If you have 2 successes, then the monster will fight until killed and doesn't need to make further morale checks. And the reason that is because you make 2 checks. The first one, whenever a side has a member of it die, everyone morale checks, and then whenever half of a side is incapacitated, not dead, incapacitated, which could be killed or otherwise, then you also make a morale check for that side. There may be situational adjustments based on, for example, having a leader with a group of goblins, for example. Goblin leaders give a morale bonus. And then mercenaries, retainers, people that the party have hired, also have morale that needs to be monitored and kept track of. The combat tables, you saw these in the back of the book. Rules for retainers, wages and hiring them. One thing I will say, it doesn't give any guidance on how much you should pay a retainer for their standard rate. It just says there should be some kind of daily fee, and then they'll take a half share of the treasure. I would have liked it if the rules included a clarification for that, but that's just something you'll have to homebrew yourself, is how much people want to pay, and there are guidelines for it in the 80s module I referenced earlier, Keep on the Borderland. How to actually hire people. The actual retainer makes a reaction roll to see if they're willing to work for you, so your charisma matters for being able to hire retainers as well. And then how much experience and gold they make. They make a morale check to see if... they make a loyalty check, which is based on your charisma modifier, to see if they're willing to keep working for you after each adventure, and that sort of things. Vehicles, this is mostly for seafaring vehicles, obviously. That's how vehicle damage works. Magic. So magic, again, is a big divergence point I want to talk about if you're coming from 5th edition. Spells are Vancian, which means that when you cast a spell, you lose it. Not permanently, but from your mind. So rather than having a pool of spells you know, and then a pool of points you can cast these with, whether that's mana or spell slots, instead, you have a certain number of spells stored in your brain at any point, and when you release one of those, you can't release it again. You could store the same spell twice, however. Other than that, it basically just notes that magic users have a spellbook that they store spells in, and then they can choose which spells to memorize at the start of the day, while divine spellcasters have access to their full magic list and pray to choose which spells they receive. Rules for spellbooks, losing them, adding new spells. Rules for magical research, creating magic items if your magic user is high enough level to, or just inventing new spells, making spell scrolls, making potions. All of this comes under this section here. It doesn't give many concrete costs for how much different magical items should be, but I will tell you, you can find those in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and those are fully compatible with the rules used in here. So if you do want to know how much it should cost to make something, you can always go track track that down, or come up with a number yourself based on some of the guidelines in here, which basically is just 10,000 gold for a magic item. As long as it's not a spell, scroll, or potion, those have more concrete rules based on what they're trying to do. Statistics for monsters, the same way players have statistics. They're very similar, so I won't go over them too much. But the most important things here to me are the number appearing. Monsters always tell you how many are going to appear in a pack, and that number is different whether you are in a dungeon, in the wilderness, or in a lair, so that's very well laid out. And treasure type, what kind of treasure you're going to roll. Then there's a full guide on how to run adventures as a referee. This is a very good section on how to actually run the game. More information on running the game and monsters and how to actually make the game interesting. It gives some examples of what you might do for some adventure scenarios. So if you're stuck for inspiration, you can always just come here, roll a d10 and see what you get. Another full panel art. How to design a wilderness, how to design a base town. Really good sketch of rules of how these kinds of things work, what kind of services might be available in a base town, who runs it. That's important for things like land ownership. When you have a barony, when you've got players that are a high enough level to own land, you need to know who are they swearing fealty to, which NPCs are in the town. Just a really nice detailed procedural guide on how to make wildernesses and towns. How to award XP. This is a very important note. Treasure that player characters bring back from an adventure is the primary means by which they gain XP, usually accounting for 3/4 or more of total XP earned. There is XP for killing monsters, but you will get most of your XP, not killing, defeating, whether that's incapacitating and subduing, whether that's avoiding and sneaking past. If you encounter a monster and it doesn't kill you, you get XP for it. But most of your XP is going to come from treasure. And again, this adds into that climate where, because combat is so deadly, because you have 3 hit points and a sword deals 1d8 damage, you want to avoid combat. But that doesn't penalize you from gaining XP, because most of your XP is going to come from treasure. So if you can avoid combat and still get the loot of the monster anyway, sneak past it, get to its hoard, or find another way of avoiding it with subterfuge, you are still going to get full XP, because you encountered the monster and lived, so you defeated it, and you got its treasure. Then there's a guide on placing treasures, what kinds of treasures you might encounter, treasure types. So again, this is a broad category of treasure types that might be associated with monsters. Different kinds of magic items, whether or not you have armors or shields, miscellaneous, potions, rings, rod staffs, wands, scrolls, maps, swords or weapons. How to roll and determine what kind of magic item you want to put in a place. Rules for determining the power of armor and shields, gems and jewelries, potions, rod staves, wands, all of these things that I just mentioned. How to create maps and scrolls. How to generate spell scrolls, how to generate maps. The open gaming license, so some legalese, and an index. And that, with a very quick blitz through at the end, is the core rules. I think these are fantastic. These give you a very strong foundation to run wilderness and dungeon crawling, and probably waterborne, but I've never run them, adventures in just about any style. It is not hard locked into fantasy. The most hard locked it gets is the fact that it uses gold coins and assumes magic rings are a thing, but you could always replace a magic ring with a magic cybernetic finger enhancement. Flavor it to your setting. But if you want concrete, specific flavor, specific mechanics for a fantasy setting, well then, the book is not short on that. Now, the core rules are what I mostly wanted to focus on, so I'm not going to spend forever going through these. I'm just going to talk about what you get in each of them. So, the fantasy genre rules comes with, in its end papers, rules for cleric turn undead, rules for character attacks, rules for thief skills, saving throws, adventuring gear, weapons, mounts, variable weapon damage, animals of burden, horses, and then it is largely a splat book of classes. Here is a halfling. They need to have Constitution 9 or Dexterity 9 to be one. Their prime requisites are Dexterity and Strength. They have 1d6 hit dice. They can go up to level 8 according to this table over here, and every class has its own separate XP requirements, which means that classes don't have to be balanced, because if a class is just stronger than another class, it probably costs more XP to level it up. Halflings have a better chance of hiding in dungeons and in the woods, so this is like an extra bonus chance to surprise things. How I like to do it is I make the party's surprise chance, and then if a class has an individual hiding benefit, such as the thieves hide in darkness, or the halflings hide in dungeons, or hide in wilderness or undergrowth, I roll that chance as a bonus chance if the party fails, so it's just an extra chance for them to get surprise, as well as their improved listening and some other bonuses. So within the classic rules, you have got a cleric, who are wisdom, prime requisite, divine protectors, dwarfs, who are short fighters, elves, who are a cross between fighters and magic users with pointy ears and some strange elfy natures, fighters, standard fighting man, strength-based, hits real good, halflings, short fighters that also have some thief stuff going on, magic users, wizards and thieves. Thief is more Indiana Jones or Lara Croft, think more Tomb Raider than Stabby McStabberson. So that's your core Splatterbook of classes. Languages, as I said, the languages you know are very important, so here's a roll table so you can randomly determine which languages your characters know if you have bonus languages. It does note that the referee might let you pick or might choose for you, but I like rolling and then just justifying it. So, why does that magic user speak the secret language of shapeshifters? You have to come up with an answer for that. And that can create these really nice emergent backstories. Rules for high level play, if you want to go above level 14, you can, which is the highest level which is the highest level the human classes can get to. Rules for going all the way up to level 36. Your equipment shop, weapons and armor, vehicles and mounts, water vehicles, vessel management and crew systems, hirelings, specialists, strongholds, how to build them, how much things cost. That is the advanced fantasy genre rules, which as a companion, you have cleric and magic user spells. All the spells a cleric can cast, all the spells a magic user can cast. This simply contains rules for all of them and how they work. Treasures. Examples of all of those treasures we saw you could generate in the core rulebook, and roll tables for deciding which one you give out. Obviously, you can determine your own treasure tables, but the fact that it comes with this huge collection of treasures is a huge plus for me. And monsters. The statistics for different monsters, how many of them appear in any given situation. So you get a description of the monster, you get its armor class, its hit dice with its number of hit points, how it attacks, its Thaco or attack bonus, its movement speed, its saving throws, its morale, its alignment, its experience, how many of them appear in the dungeon or in wilderness, and then what treasure you get for killing it, and any special abilities. Same format. Big book of monsters the whole way through. This monsters book also very helpfully at the back has rules for NPC strongholds and how NPC strongholds work, generating NPC encounters. So if you come across another party in a dungeon, what's the party composition? What level are they? As well as wonderful wilderness roll tables to determine random encounters in the wilderness if you don't want to make your own random encounter table. And for random encounters in the dungeon, organised by how deep within the earth they are. So at a high level, you might get bandits or kobolds, and in the depths of a dungeon, you'll come across experienced adventurers, hill giants, purple worms, and all of these creatures of the depths. That is Old School Essentials. I love it. It's one of the best role-playing games I've ever read. Its design is smooth and elegant. It encourages emergent play and non-combat focused resolution. Though it lacks a universal resolution mechanic, its procedures system more than makes up for that by allowing you to always know exactly what the next thing to do is in a clear and concise, well-formatted form factor. On that note, I think it's one of the most well-presented RPGs on the market today. The way that all of the content you're looking at is laid out on one page is fantastic. Very rarely do you need to actually change which page you're looking at. The modularity means that it can be expanded with new books in a beautiful way that has already led to huge amounts of growth. I, sitting on the shelf behind me, not only have the advanced fantasy rules that Gavin's already released, but also a book called BX Options, which is basically just a splat book of additional classes and rules for creating classes. BX Class Options. I'm really looking forward to seeing more and more books turned out that expand Old School Essentials. It is, I think, has become my favourite RPG of all time. It was previously contending with Savage Worlds, and I think it topped it. I cannot recommend this game enough. I have run it regularly and constantly over a very long period of time now. It has a wonderful community online who are supportive and helpful and kind and love creating homebrew and love creating content. Old School Essentials has become my favourite role-playing game of all time. If something tops it, I will be amazed. The mechanics are elegant. Sometimes you have to piece them a bit together. There's entire blog posts dedicated to that out there in the wild. But to be honest, a lot of that was because they didn't have Old School Essentials, they had Basic and Expert. Old School Essentials solves a lot of it, and the small pieces it doesn't are really just a case of read the rules until you get it. Like Surprise being the stealth system, but not quite. Like the rules for listening and the general skill mechanics. the way that saving throws give you these huge options for emergent descriptive gameplay that isn't tied in to hard mechanics. There's this beautiful example in the Dungeon Master's Guide for First Edition, which has the same saving throw system as this, where it says it doesn't matter how the fighter avoids the dragon fire. If he's chained up to a rock and a drag is breathing fire on him, if he passes that save, he breaks 3 of those chains and drops under the chain and finds a crack in the rock to avoid the fire in. Is that really any less realistic than the dragon in the first place? And it's this compelling argument. And I actually think that the rules light nature, it's not rules light. It has very well codified procedures. But those procedures never tell you how to describe the fiction. The fiction is left free. It has well codified, well written rules. It is not rules light, but those rules never tell you what happens. They tell you how to find out what happens and leave what happens in your hands. And it is genuinely spectacular.